Chapter 1. The Birth of a Formula. In the earliest mornings of the Roman Republic, long before marble facades gleamed under imperial banners, there were only small settlements crouched beside the Tiber River, clusters of brick and timber, never imagining they would one day command the known world. Among these modest beginnings, a quiet revolution took shape. It began not with proclamations or triumphal parades, but with builders carrying baskets of powders and fragments of stone. They worked before dawn, while the air was still cool, stirring mixtures so heavy that even strong men paused to catch their breath. No one yet called it opus caementicium, the concrete that would become the empire's hidden backbone. But they sensed they were handling something unusual. These early mortars were simple: slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, mixed with crushed rock and water. When wet, the lime bound the particles together into a paste that hardened over days. It was sturdier than mud and straw, stronger than clay, but still imperfect. Walls built with it cracked under rain and heat, crumbling back into dust. Builders experimented in small ways, changing proportions, soaking lime longer, or grinding stones finer. Some believed the secret lay in how long lime cooled after burning. Others swore the water must come from special springs. These ideas passed among artisans like quiet gossip, growing into shared knowledge no less valuable than any law. In the Forum Boarium, the city's busy cattle market, merchants stacked amphorae against crude walls and watched them sag each winter. According to legend, a mason named Lucius Terratilius wondered if the gray ash from cooking fires could strengthen the mix. No one preserved his name in stone, but such experiments did happen. Ash was plentiful. He sprinkled handfuls into his lime trough and worked the paste until it darkened. The first batch hardened slowly, but when he struck it later, it felt dense and unyielding. Word spread among builders. What Lucius used was more than ordinary ash. It was volcanic powder brought from Campania, where Mount Vesuvius brooded over the coast. For generations, people in those harbors noticed the soil's peculiar property. It clung to moisture and hardened into a mass as strong as tufa rock. The Romans named this miraculous dust Pozzolana, after the port town of Puteoli. At first it was only an expensive curiosity, shipped upriver in sacks to wealthy patrons willing to try it in foundations. But each test proved its worth. When pozzolana blended with lime, the mixture did not merely dry, it cured, forming microscopic crystals that grew stronger with time instead of weakening. These small discoveries did not draw attention in the Senate or earn coins stamped with any mason's face. Yet in workshops behind markets and along the edges of new villas, walls quietly rose that resisted weather like nothing before. Observers puzzled at how some structures endured floods while their neighbors dissolved. The secret was invisible. Volcanic ash and lime, creating a cement so stable that even water could not break it apart. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Rome was expanding fast. Conquests filled warehouses with treasures and streets with people. Grain from Sicily, silver from Iberia, and knowledge from Greece arrived daily. Among these gifts was the understanding that materials could be combined into something stronger than any single element. Some Greek builders had once used volcanic sand to resist earthquakes, but the Romans refined the technique into a systematic craft. Builders began to treat pozzolana as the heart of a new substance. They recorded proportions in ledgers and passed recipes by word of mouth. For walls needing strength, they used 2 parts pozzolana to 1 part lime. For lighter domes, they blended pumice into the mix. The knowledge lived in the hands of craftsmen more than in any written manual. Apprentices learned by watching and repeating until the steps were as natural as breathing. In the Velabrum district, a modest warehouse went up with this new concrete. It was plain, just a rectangle of walls and arches. But when the Tiber flooded in 121 BCE, it stood unbroken while neighboring shops fell into ruin. It became, without fanfare, the first proof that Rome had stumbled onto something lasting. Later generations would look back and marvel that such humble beginnings led to domes that seemed to defy gravity and harbors that defied the sea. But at that dawn of discovery, no one could yet foresee the empire's future in stone. There were only builders at sunrise, mixing lime and ash into a heavy paste, hoping that in this simple union they had found something that would hold fast for centuries to come. Chapter 2. Learning from the Greeks. Long before Roman ships ruled the Mediterranean, the Greeks had already built their own legacy in stone. From the ports of Syracuse to the temples of Corinth, Greek architects and masons learned how to tame the land's restless power. They raised theaters that seemed to float against hillsides, and piers that faced the sea's anger without surrendering. Their knowledge of lime mortars and pozzolanic sands had deep roots, born of centuries spent watching the earth's secrets reveal themselves in bits and fragments. When Roman ambassadors first walked among Greek cities, they noticed how walls older than any Roman foundation still stood unbroken. Some of these structures survived not by accident, but because Greek builders understood how to blend lime with volcanic ash to make something more enduring. In their ports, the Greeks lined harbors with blocks set in a gray cement that hardened underwater. To the Romans, this seemed a little short of sorcery. They were used to mortar that cracked when waves struck it or that dissolved after heavy rain. But in Greek construction yards, they saw workmen mixing soft ash into lime, pouring it into wooden molds, and watching it transform into stone. Roman engineers were never content merely to admire. They took notes, copied tools, and questioned craftsmen until they pieced together the recipe. Slowly, word returned to Rome that Greece held not only philosophy and sculpture, but also the key to building cities meant to last. As Roman influence spread through Magna Graecia, the Greek colonies of southern Italy, the exchange grew richer. Roman officials commissioned Greek builders to erect temples and docks along the Italian coast. These projects became quiet laboratories where ideas mingled. One of the earliest Roman attempts to adapt Greek techniques took place near the Bay of Naples. Builders there experimented with combining local lime with Campanian pozzolana, testing whether the Greek methods could be improved. They discovered that by sifting the ash more finely and adjusting the proportions, the mortar not only hardened under seawater, but also resisted cracking from heat. This detail alone changed the future of construction. For the first time, Romans envisioned harbors that would not need constant repair, or temples that would endure more than a generation. In workshops near Cumae and Puteoli, Greek and Roman craftsmen worked side by side. They spoke in different tongues but shared the same gestures, the same cautious care in measuring each scoop of ash and lime. They learned together that the mixture had to be stirred slowly, never rushed, and that seawater often gave a stronger set than fresh water. It was said that in these coastal yards, more knowledge was traded by hand than by any formal treaty. The invention of Roman concrete, and why it still won't crumble. In the hush of ancient corridors, where the Mediterranean winds whisper through weathered arches, a secret still holds the empire together, long after emperors have vanished and armies have turned to dust. This is the story of Roman concrete, a humble mixture that defied centuries, outlasting kingdoms and time itself. Chapter 3. The Gift of Pozzolana. Along the sun-baked coastline of Campania, just beyond the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, the earth had always carried its own quiet fire. The ground was warm to the touch, even in winter, and the hills trembled now and then with murmurs from deep beneath the surface. Locals had long known that the soil here was different, soft, grayish, clinging to water in ways ordinary sand never did. To farmers, it was stubborn, to potters, unpredictable. But to the builders of Rome, it would soon become priceless. The discovery was not sudden. Long before concrete became an imperial secret, shepherds and fishermen near the Bay of Naples had noticed the strange behavior of their soil. When mixed with water and left to dry, it turned not to dust, but to something firm, something that resisted wind and waves. No one thought to name it until builders from Puteoli began to dig it in earnest. They called it Pozzolana after their town. Pale gray or brown, sometimes tinged with pink, it came from the crumbled tuff and ash of ancient eruptions. Unlike ordinary sand, Pozzolana contained particles of volcanic glass and minerals, remnants of earth forged under immense heat. When blended with slaked lime and water, it didn't just dry like plaster. It reacted. It hardened through a slow, steady process called pozzolanic reaction. Lime molecules binding to the silicates in the ash, forming tight crystalline webs that grew stronger with time. The genius of Roman builders lay not only in discovering this material, but in understanding its potential. They saw that pozzolana changed the very nature of construction. Most ancient mortars degraded when wet, but concrete made with volcanic ash, cured underwater, grew harder in the presence of salt. This one property opened the way for things no civilization had done before. Harbors no longer needed to be rebuilt every few years. Bridges could stretch farther. Foundations could rise even in marshland. Builders began to experiment in secret. On docks near Cumae, they poured pozzolanic concrete into wooden forms submerged in the sea. Days later, they returned to find the molds filled not with slurry, but solid stone. On hills above Baiae, where villas clung to cliffs, pozzolana was packed into retaining walls that held steady despite earthquakes and rain. The material adapted to its environment. It could be mixed thick for columns, fluid for vaults, or porous for drainage. It was not uniform, it was versatile. By 100 BCE, barges loaded with sacks of pozzolana moved steadily upriver to Rome. Warehouses near the Tiber overflowed with the gray powder. In the Subura district, contractors paid high prices to mix it into the foundations of bathhouses and tenements. In the Campus Martius, engineers began to imagine structures taller and wider than before. The limitations of brick and stone were dissolving. Pozzolana's value was not just practical, it was symbolic. Rome had found something in her own land that no other empire possessed. A natural gift that could outlast the tides, the seasons, even time. The concrete born from this ash was a quiet triumph, unadorned, often hidden beneath marble or stucco, but it was what held everything together. Behind every forum colonnade and triumphal arch, beneath every aqueduct and villa portico, Pozzolana did its work in silence. In time, Roman engineers began refining recipes. For seawalls, they mixed 1 part lime to 2 parts pozzolana with chunks of tuff or brick. For domes, they added pumice to lighten the weight. And always they poured with care, layer by layer, letting each lift settle before adding the next. No one called it chemistry, but it was. A slow mastery born of patient observation. The most remarkable feature of pozzolana concrete wasn't its strength, it was its memory. As the years passed, the bonds within it continued to evolve. Long after the tools were gone and the scaffolds taken down, the concrete kept curing, growing more stable. Even centuries later, when parts of the Roman world had fallen silent, their structures remained upright, stubborn in the face of wind and ruin. Pozzolana was more than ash. It was the quiet promise that Rome would not be forgotten. And long after the fires of Vesuvius cooled, the stones it helped shape would remember the hands that mixed them, the cities they supported, and the idea that something made with patience and purpose could last beyond even empire. Chapter 4. Mixing by Moonlight. Not every Roman project could wait for the dawn. As the city grew, construction sites multiplied, temples rising near crowded markets, warehouses pressed along the riverbank, new roads unfurling toward the distant hills. In summer, the heat made daytime labor unbearable. Lime and pozzolana cured too quickly under a blazing sun, and the air itself grew so thick with dust that masons coughed between every breath. So the work shifted to hours when the city was quieter, when the darkness offered a gentler hand. Long before the first light touched the tiled roofs, crews gathered by torchlight. Flames flickered across scaffolds and piles of crushed stone. Shadows stretched over troughs where the day's batches of mortar would be born. In these hours, the air smelled of damp earth and lime dust. The rhythm of mixing began before the forum stirred. A slow turning of paddles in heavy slurries, the scrape of baskets filled with volcanic ash. It was in these moonlit intervals that many of Rome's great foundations took shape. Here, hidden from the bustle, builders could measure carefully, free from distraction. Apprentices carried buckets of water drawn from wells, careful not to spill a drop. Foremen checked the proportions by eye, a skill honed over years. A mound of pozzolana here, a scoop of slaked lime there, then water poured in a thin stream until the mixture turned a color halfway between stone and cloud. Some recipes had become almost ritual. For harbor works, the lime had to cool for a set number of days after burning. For vaults and domes, the ash was sieved twice to remove impurities. The process was slow because it had to be. Rushed mortar set unevenly, cracked under pressure, and betrayed its makers. But when mixed patiently, with the right measure of care and time, the paste hardened into something that could withstand centuries. Workers moved in quiet sequence. One poured, another stirred, a third tested the consistency by pressing a palm against the surface. If it held its shape, it was ready. If not, more pozzolana or water would be added. Each step mattered. even when no one would ever see the layers once the final marble cladding was set in place. Above them, the stars turned over the Palatine Hill, and the night carried the distant sounds of Rome at rest. Dogs barking in the alleys, barges creaking at their moorings. But at the edges of the city, where construction never slept, the work continued. Torches hissed as damp air met flame. Men's silhouettes moved among stacks of timber, the outlines of future walls already taking form in the darkness. There was something almost solemn in these scenes, the knowledge that the mixture in the trough could, if prepared well, outlive every hand that touched it. No inscription would mark the names of those who mixed by moonlight. Their labor would be hidden beneath painted stucco and carved stone, yet without them, none of the monuments would stand. As dawn approached, the crews worked faster. Lime and pozzolana had to be poured before the day grew hot enough to spoil the set. When the first shafts of sunlight spilled across the rooftops, the troughs were empty, and the new layers of concrete lay smooth and damp, ready to harden into permanence. In time, Romans would grow accustomed to these night rituals. They became part of the city's pulse, evidence that even in darkness, the empire's ambition did not sleep. Every dock that held against storms, every bathhouse dome that resisted earthquakes, every aqueduct arch that spanned a valley owed something to these hours when torches were the only light. It was said, among builders, that pozzolana remembered the moment it touched water, that each grain, once awakened, began its slow transformation into stone. Whether this was belief or truth hardly mattered. What counted was the result, walls that would endure long after their makers had passed into memory. In those quiet shifts before dawn, Rome laid not only the foundations of her buildings, but the foundation of her legacy. The mixture of lime and volcanic ash was more than a recipe. It was a promise in every handful, a conviction that what humans shaped with care and foresight could last longer than any empire or emperor. Chapter 5. The Port of Cosa. Along the rugged Tyrrhenian coast, where waves struck the land with steady impatience, the Romans set out to prove that their new material could tame the sea itself. The settlement of Cosa, perched on a promontory above the surf, had begun as a military colony, a foothold against pirates and restless tribes inland. But it was more than an outpost. It was an experiment in building a harbor that would not crumble under the tides. Before the invention of pozzolanic concrete, harbors were fragile affairs. Wooden pilings rotted within seasons, and stone blocks, no matter how carefully stacked, shifted and loosened as the waves beat against them. Maintaining a usable port demanded endless repairs, an exhausting cycle of decay and rebuilding. But the Romans who came to Cosa believed they could break that pattern. They began with simple wooden frames, cofferdams sunk into the shallow seabed, forming rectangles the size of small courtyards. Inside each frame, teams of laborers dumped coarse rubble, broken tiles, chunks of tufa, fist-sized stones, layer after layer. Above this fill, baskets of pozzolana and lime were hoisted on ropes and emptied into troughs. Water churned around their ankles as they worked. There was no waiting for dry conditions. In fact, the presence of seawater was part of the plan. As the slurry seeped down between the stones, it filled every gap, every hidden crevice. The reaction between lime and volcanic ash began almost immediately. Over hours and days, the mix hardened underwater into a single mass, bonding the rubble into artificial rock. Where before there had been only shifting seabed, now there was the outline of a permanent quay. The work was slow, measured by tides as much as by tools. Crews returned again and again to check the curing progress, marking the changes by touch rather than sight. If the surface was firm under a pressed thumb, they judged the set to be good. If it yielded, they left it longer. No one yet fully understood the chemistry, how the seawater helped create crystals that would grow tighter over time, but the results spoke for themselves. When the first quay stood clear of the waves, local fishermen gathered to watch. They were used to harbors that washed away, to jetties that vanished after winter storms. But the Roman construction held. Even in rough weather, it did not shudder. Even when struck by driftwood and debris, it remained whole. With each completed section, confidence grew. More cofferdams were sunk, more rubble poured, more lime and pozzolana mixed by lantern light. Slowly the harbor of Cosa took shape, a series of stout moles and platforms that transformed a wild stretch of coast into a safe haven. Grain ships could now dock without fear of grounding or splintering. Galleys could shelter from sudden squalls. When the project was finished, the port looked unremarkable. No statues decorated its edges, no triumphal arch announced its purpose. But those who understood the work knew it was proof of something important. Rome had found a way to build structures that did not simply resist nature, but embraced it. The sea, once an enemy to be kept out, became a silent partner in hardening the concrete into permanence. Years later, storms would come, great walls of water crashing against the moles. Where older harbors had splintered or subsided, Cosa held firm. Roman engineers took note. They understood that what succeeded here could succeed anywhere. Plans began for larger projects, the harbor of Puteoli, the great breakwaters of Caesarea, even the ports that would feed the heart of the empire itself. Yet amid these ambitions, the lessons of Cosa remained simple. Builders learned that patience mattered as much as strength, that the right blend of lime and ash could not be rushed, that each layer must settle before the next was poured. These were lessons written not in treatises, but in the stubborn endurance of stone under salt wind. Standing on the quay at dawn, a person could look down into the water and see the pale outlines of submerged blocks, still exactly where they had been placed. The tide flowed over them, indifferent to history, yet powerless to erase what Rome had set. Here, in this quiet port, the empire's promise of permanence began to feel real. In time, Cosa would be surpassed by greater harbors, overshadowed by grander feats, but it was here that the Romans proved the sea itself could be shaped into an ally. And in the hush between waves, the pozzolanic concrete continued its slow work, curing, tightening, becoming stronger than the men who mixed it could ever have imagined. Chapter 6. The Hidden Engineers. Behind every grand design of Rome, every temple portico and triumphal arch, stood men whose names were seldom recorded. They were the hidden engineers, the quiet force that turned raw materials into monuments. In an age when victories were claimed by generals and emperors, these builders carried their own form of conquest, mastery over stone, lime, and volcanic ash. Some were free citizens who learned their trade in family workshops, sons of masons who had built simple tabernae before the Republic dreamed of empire. Others were enslaved artisans captured from Greek cities and pressed into service in Roman yards. A few were specialists, surveyors and architects brought in from Alexandria or Rhodes, carrying scrolls filled with diagrams no Roman hand had drawn. Together they formed a fellowship of skill and patience that quietly shaped the empire's future. Their work began long before a foundation stone was set. Surveyors measured the land, laying out chalk lines on bare soil, while overseers paced behind them. Scribes took notes on the slope of ground and the quality of the clay beneath it. Lime burners stacked limestone in great kilns, tending the fires day and night until the rock split and powdered under a mallet. Ash merchants negotiated contracts to ferry puzzolana upriver. Each role, humble in isolation, became essential when joined to the rest. In workshops at the city's edge, wooden molds were built to hold the fresh concrete in place. These forms were sturdy but temporary, destined to be stripped away once the curing was done. Planks were smeared with oil to keep the setting mortar from clinging too tightly. Every tool, trowel, paddle, sieve, was laid out in careful order. To the untrained eye, these preparations seemed ordinary, but the hidden engineers knew that any haste, any carelessness could doom a structure before the first layer was poured. When construction began, the work moved in measured stages. Laborers carried baskets of rubble to mix with the paste, broken pottery, crushed tufa, discarded bricks. This coarse aggregate gave mass and stability to the concrete. Lime and pozzolana were sifted together in wide trays, then blended with water until the mixture turned thick and heavy. The crews moved in silence, each man attuned to the subtle changes in color and consistency. The foreman walked among them, pressing fingertips into fresh mortar to feel whether it was ready. They could tell by touch alone if a batch was too wet or too dry. If the balance was wrong, they ordered more lime or ash, knowing that a single misstep could mean hairline cracks that would one day grow into failures. For underwater work, like the quays of Corso or the moles of Puteoli, the process was even more exacting. Concrete had to be poured within cofferdams or lowered in weighted boxes that would sink through seawater to the seabed. There, hidden from view, it settled into place, its pozzolanic reaction beginning in the dark. No one could watch it harden, but all trusted that it would. Among the hidden engineers, knowledge passed not only by instruction, but by quiet observation. Apprentices learned to see the way a fresh layer glistened under torchlight, to listen for the hollow note that signaled an air pocket trapped below. Older craftsmen shared secrets only when they believed the younger ones had earned them. Recipes were seldom written down. They lived in memory, shaped by years of practice. Even in grand projects like the temples of the Forum or the great cisterns that supplied the baths, these builders received little recognition. Official inscriptions named patrons and magistrates, never the masons or lime burners. Yet it was their discipline and judgment that determined whether a wall would endure. At the day's end, when tools were cleaned and the last wheelbarrow rolled away, the hidden engineers often lingered. They walked the site, studying the fresh courses of concrete as the evening cooled them. Some touched the surface, feeling the latent warmth of curing lime beneath the skin of stone. In that warmth lay the quiet satisfaction of work done properly. In time, emperors would boast of their monuments. Visitors would marvel at the arches and domes. But the men who had measured, mixed, and poured understood a different kind of pride. the knowledge that their careful hands had left something behind that would last longer than any victory parade or laurel wreath. Their legacy was not inscribed in marble, but embedded in the bones of the city itself. Wherever Roman concrete endured, under roads, in piers, beneath the facades of temples, the hidden engineers remained present, unseen but essential, their craft holding the empire together long after their names had faded.
Chapter 7. The Pantheon Rises.
In the heart of Rome, where the narrow streets of the Campus Martius widened into open courtyards, a vision took shape that would surpass every other dome ever imagined. The Pantheon was not merely a temple. It was a declaration that Roman concrete, when mastered, could defy the very weight of the sky. The first version of the building had been lost to fire. The second had been struck by lightning and reduced to rubble. By the time Emperor Hadrian set his mind to rebuilding it, Roman engineers had refined their craft to a point no earlier generation could rival. They no longer feared failure. They believed that the right mixture of lime, pozzolana, and aggregate could achieve what stone alone never could. When construction began around 118 CE, the city watched with curiosity. A rotunda of such immense scale seemed reckless. Its diameter stretched over 43 meters, far wider than any dome the Greeks had ever built. To attempt this with concrete was audacious. Yet the builders approached the project with a quiet confidence earned by decades of experiments. Their method was both simple and ingenious. Instead of erecting the dome as a single uniform mass, they layered the concrete in concentric rings, each lighter than the one below. At the base, the mixture was dense, lime, pozzolana, and chunks of heavy basalt. This foundation supported the immense thrust of the walls. Higher up, the formula shifted. Builders replaced basalt with brick fragments, then with tufa, then with pumice, a volcanic stone so light it would float in water. Each layer reduced the overall weight, lessening the stress on the dome's curve. This delicate balance required endless vigilance. At every stage, foremen inspected the mix, testing the consistency, adjusting proportions to keep the material workable without compromising strength. Wooden scaffolds rose inside the rotunda, an intricate forest of beams supporting the shuttering that shaped the curve. From the floor, the framework looked like a labyrinth. Crews moved among the timbers by lamplight, carrying baskets of concrete up ramps and ladders. In these dim spaces, the familiar rhythm of Roman building continued, the steady pour, the careful tamping, the pause to let each layer settle. Above it all, the oculus waited, a perfect circle open to the sky. The builders understood that leaving this aperture unsealed served two purposes. It reduced the weight at the dome's crown, and it invited the heavens inside, making the Pantheon both a temple and a cosmic calendar. Sunlight would track across the coffered ceiling in a silent procession, marking the hours and seasons. As the dome neared completion, the strain on the formwork grew immense. Each day's work added more mass pressing outward, seeking to escape the curve and collapse. But the pozzolanic concrete held its form. It cured slowly, bonding into a single, unified shell. When at last the wooden supports were removed, the dome remained suspended above the rotunda like an impossible stone sky. People came from across the empire to see it. Some believed it was held up by hidden chains, others that it was supported by magic. Few understood that the secret lay not in sorcery, but in a recipe perfected over generations: lime, volcanic ash, and the patient discipline of Roman builders. Inside, the air felt cool even at midday. The coffered panels carved into the dome's surface lightened its weight further, reducing material without sacrificing strength. As the sun moved across the oculus, Each recess caught the light in turn, revealing the subtle variations in aggregate. Specks of pumice near the crown, heavier stones below. The dome was not a single material, but a gradient, tailored precisely to withstand the forces pressing down upon it. Hadrian's architects left no written manual detailing how it was achieved. Knowledge passed by example, by the careful observation of apprentices who watched each handful of ash and lime poured into the molds. In the centuries to come, other builders would attempt to replicate it, but none would match the Pantheon's perfect balance. When visitors stepped inside, they often fell silent. No words could match the sensation of standing beneath so vast a space, enclosed by so thin a shell. Here, Roman concrete had achieved something that seemed beyond human scale. Proof that the empire's ingenuity could rival the gods themselves. Yet for all its grandeur, the Pantheon remained true to the principles that had shaped the quays of Cosa and the warehouses along the Tiber. It was built layer by layer, with mixtures adapted to each purpose by hands that labored without acclaim. Its endurance came not from mystery, but from care, the discipline to measure precisely, to pour deliberately, to trust the slow curing that would make the concrete harder as the years passed. In the end, the Pantheon was more than a temple. It was a quiet triumph of material and method, a testament that what began as a humble experiment in lime and ash could one day become the most perfect dome the world had ever known.
Chapter 8.
A winter of scarcity. Winter arrived earlier than anyone expected that year. By late October, frost silvered the pastures and the herd's milk yield fell sharply. The novices rose each morning to find the pails half as full as before. In the kitchen, the cauldron simmered over low flames, but fewer wheels emerged from the vats. Brother Conrad kept his composure, though he knew how precarious the coming months would be. Cheese was not only food, it was the monastery's surest store of wealth and nourishment. If the herd could not sustain them, they would need to rely on their cellar reserves. The monks took inventory in solemn quiet. Row after row of hard wheels lay on the shelves, aging patiently. There were soft cheeses as well, but these would be eaten first, for they would not last the winter. The abbot reminded everyone that moderation was essential. No feast days would be marked with lavish portions. Every crumb had to be accounted for. In the scriptorium, Brother Anselm recorded the shortage. He wrote that a true test of any community was not how it prospered in abundance, but how it endured lean times. His ink froze in the well more than once that December, and the novices took turns warming his fingers by the brazier. Yet even in hardship, the monks found reason for gratitude. The cheeses made in autumn had matured beautifully. Each wheel, carefully turned and brushed, was a testament to the labor of many hands. When cut, they revealed dense golden interiors, rich with the memory of summer pastures. Each evening, the monks gathered in the refectory to share their simple meals. A slice of cheese, a heel of bread, a cup of broth. As they ate, they spoke quietly of the year's harvests, the trials their neighbors faced, and the hope that spring would be kinder. No one complained, for they understood that scarcity was woven into the fabric of life, as necessary as any blessing. Occasionally, A pilgrim would arrive at the gatehouse, thin and shivering. Though their own stores were low, the brothers never turned anyone away. A portion of cheese was always set aside for those in need. In this, the abbey remained true to its purpose, to be a haven, however humble, in a world often indifferent to suffering. When the first thaw came, it was greeted with quiet relief. Snow melted from the cloister roofs. The herd began to graze again. Slowly, the vats filled with fresh milk, and the work resumed its familiar rhythms. That winter, the monks learned that what sustained them was not simply the food they stored, but the discipline and compassion that bound them together. In the cellar, the cheeses waited. In the hearts of the brothers, so did hope. Chapter 9. The Chronicle of Cheese. When spring finally broke, Brother Anselm resolved to gather everything the abbey had learned about cheese-making into a single manuscript. For years he had kept scattered notes, parchment scraps with recipes, observations, and lists of failures and triumphs. Now he began the slow task of ordering them into a book that could endure after he was gone. He titled it simply, Liber Caseorum, the Book of Cheeses. Each page held the fruits of generations, techniques, measures, advice. He described how to recognize the quality of milk by scent alone, how to prepare rennet from the stomach of a calf, and how to build the wooden forms in which curds were pressed. The novices watched in awe as the book took shape. They had never seen all this knowledge in one place. It seemed to them a kind of magic, that so much could be preserved in ink and vellum, safe from the forgetfulness of time. Brother Conrad contributed as well. He offered comments on the chapters about washing rinds, suggested corrections to certain measures, and added a few anecdotes of failed experiments that had taught them the most. The abbot himself reviewed the manuscript, approving its clarity and precision. Merchants and travelers who visited the abbey sometimes glimpsed the work in progress. They marveled that monks, whose lives seemed so removed from commerce, had compiled such practical wisdom. Yet the brothers saw no contradiction. To them, cheese-making was an extension of their vows, a testament to diligence, humility, and respect for creation. As the Liber Caseorum grew, the novices began to copy passages by hand, creating spare volumes to be sent to other monasteries. In this way, the abbey's knowledge would travel farther than any brother might walk in a lifetime. When, at last, the manuscript was complete, Brother Anselm closed it with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He knew that no book could hold every lesson. There would always be new experiments, new discoveries. But for the first time, the abbey's collective memory was gathered between two covers, a guide for all who would come after. And so, the Book of Cheeses was placed on a shelf in the scriptorium, next to treatises on medicine and theology. It seemed to the monks an entirely fitting place. For in their eyes, to care for milk and curds was not so different from caring for souls. Both required patience, curiosity, and faith that small, unseen labors could transform the world. Chapter 10. Herbs, Flowers, and Experimentation. In the cloister garden, spring had returned like a familiar friend, draping the monastery walls in the soft green of renewal. The orchard trees were just beginning to blossom, and the air carried a fragrance that stirred even the most disciplined monks from their usual silence. It was during one of those quiet mornings, as the mist lifted from the stone paths, that Brother Toma noticed the thyme blooming earlier than usual. He leaned close, brushed its tiny petals with reverence, and made a quiet note on a scrap of parchment. In the abbey, herbs were never mere decoration, they were purpose. Brother Toma had tended the herbarium for over 30 years. Beneath his hands, rosemary, sage, lavender, hyssop, and marjoram thrived. His apothecary shelves held jars of dried blossoms and roots, each labeled in precise Latin script. Most were destined for medicinal use: teas for fever, salves for aching joints, infusions for calming the heart. But that year something different stirred in the air, an idea not new but ripened by time. Brother Conrad had long believed that cheese, like prayer, could be deepened by intention. He often spoke of how subtle changes, water temperature, milk freshness, curd size, transformed the outcome of every wheel. Watching the herbs sway in the garden one afternoon, he found himself wondering, if monks trusted the land to heal the body, could not the land also shape the soul of a cheese? He brought the thought to the abbot not as a proposal, but as a question. The abbot, a careful man, tilted his head thoughtfully. "Herbs in measure," he said, "have flavored bread and oil for generations. Why not milk?" And so, cautiously, reverently, the monks began to experiment. It began with small batches: a sprig of rosemary steeped in the brine for half an hour, a wheel rubbed gently with crushed sage and sea salt, lavender dusted over a soft-rind cheese as it dried on the rack. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible at first. But Brother Conrad, with his seasoned tongue and steady memory, noticed. The rosemary left a faint piney finish. The sage brought warmth, echoing the scent of cloistered kitchens in winter. The lavender softened the sharpness of the rind. Brother Toma joined the dairy monks for the first time in years. He carried baskets of petals and sprigs, not to be hung for medicine, but to be folded gently into cheesecloth or laid between aging wheels. The herbarium, once a quiet room of dried leaves, became a place of consultation and debate. Which part of the plant was most potent? The leaf, the flower, the root? When was the best time to harvest? Could marjoram overpower a young cheese? Should hyssop be used only with hard wheels? As summer advanced, the cheeses began to take on personalities. The monks nicknamed them affectionately the Green Band for a wheel crusted with thyme and wild garlic, St. Juliana's Bloom for the lavender-aged cheese that ripened with a pale purple tint. A firmer cheese brushed with rosemary and nettle was dubbed the Cloister Guard for its barky, serious character. Word spread quietly. A merchant from Angers, upon tasting one of the herb-aged cheeses during his visit, exclaimed that he had never imagined cheese could taste like a field in prayer. He returned the following season with linen bags and offered to buy all the herbal wheels in stock. The abbot, as always, declined any sale that would strip the brothers' own stores, but the gesture confirmed something they had begun to suspect. Their experiment was no longer mere curiosity. It was a contribution. The novices were given new tasks. They helped press petals into molds, carefully weighing herbs on brass scales, learning not just when to add, but when not to. A few overzealous batches proved that too much lavender turned floral into soapy. Sage, when added too early, overwhelmed the subtleties of milk. These were not failures, they were lessons. And in the quiet way that monastic learning always moved, the new methods found their way into the margins of Liber Cassiorum. Brother Anselm, at first skeptical, devoted several chapters to the influence of herbs on rind chemistry and texture. He even began to study Galenic texts for references to medieval culinary uses of plants. The connections between medicine and food, once parallel, began to intertwine. Beyond the monastery, changes followed. Nearby abbeys wrote letters requesting samples. Some offered to exchange their own records in return. notes on ash aging, on cheese wrapped in bark, even on wheels soaked in fermented apple cider. It became clear that monks across Europe were asking the same questions, seeking not novelty, but refinement. At the year's end, during the final shared meal of the season, a single wheel was placed at the center of the refectory table. It had been aged for 4 months, brushed weekly with brine steeped in rosemary, marjoram, and thyme. The rind glowed golden under candlelight, and its scent was faintly reminiscent of summer hills. Each monk received a thin slice, and silence followed. Not the silence of duty, but of awe. No one applauded, no one declared it a miracle, but in that moment, surrounded by stone and shadow, they understood something. God hid more in milk than we first imagined. And so herbs joined the Abbey's story, not as ornament, not as indulgence, but as voice, a whisper from the garden carried into the wheel, into the hands of monks who listened. The morning the pilgrim arrived, the sky had not yet decided whether to clear or to rain. A cold wind sifted through the orchard and carried the faint scent of straw and rosemary from the cheese cellars. The porter was accustomed to strangers at the gate, merchants with their mules, farmers carrying letters, the occasional monk from another priory seeking shelter. But this man was different. His robe, once dyed a pilgrim's deep blue, was now the color of old parchment, bleached by sun and worn thin at the elbows. A strip of wool was tied around his left boot, which had split at the sole so badly that he walked with an uneven gait. Yet his eyes, gray as the sea, were bright with purpose as he leaned against the low wall and waited to be noticed. The porter offered a clay cup of water and the blessing of the day. The pilgrim drank slowly, pressing his cracked lips together as if memorizing the taste. He spoke in a voice made hoarse by distance. I have come from Rouen, and I go to Compostela. But all along the way I have heard of this place. He paused to glance over the stone buildings, the dovecot, the quiet rows of vegetables. They say your cheese sustains more than the body. Brother Conrad, summoned from the dairy, met the man near the gate. He had a kind face, made kind not by softness, but by practice. Practice in rising before dawn, in steady labor, in listening without impatience. He asked the pilgrim's name. I am called Etienne, the man replied, though it matters little on the road. They brought Etienne into the infirmary, where Brother Thomas examined the blisters that covered his heels and the raw skin beneath the broken boot. A warm basin of lavender water eased the pilgrim's feet. A novice prepared a poultice of marigold and honey to soothe the wounds. While they worked, Etienne explained that his journey had begun more than a year before, when he sold the small patch of land he had inherited to fund his pilgrimage. He carried little but his staff, a leather pouch of letters of introduction, and a faith that had survived many disappointments.
It was this faith that fascinated Brother Conrad.
Here was a man who had walked across provinces, crossing rivers swollen with thaw, passing through forests where robbers waited, enduring hunger that gnawed more cruelly than any blizzard. Yet he did not complain. He did not boast. He spoke as if each hardship had been a kind of teacher, stripping away illusions to leave only what mattered. By midday, Etienne was strong enough to sit upright. The brothers laid before him a meal, a heel of coarse bread, a bowl of thin onion broth, and 2 slices of cheese. One a hard wheal aged since autumn, the other a soft herbed round just removed from the cellar. Etienne ate slowly. The hard cheese he chewed with care, as if it required remembrance as much as hunger. The soft cheese he held on his tongue, eyes half closed, until he swallowed. Then he looked up. "I have eaten in castles and stables," he said, "but never have I tasted such quiet." The novices shifted, uncertain whether the remark was praise or puzzlement. But Brother Conrad understood. He asked Etienne to explain. "On the road," the pilgrim began, "a meal is often loud. You must eat quickly. There is bargaining, shouting, the clatter of spoons, the fear that the food will run out. But here, I think I taste the hours, the patient waiting, the way someone's hands turned these curds without hurry." Brother Conrad nodded. He explained how the cheese was made, not just the steps, but the intention. How no wheel was ever rushed. How the seasons, the herds, the herbs all found their voice in the rind. Etienne listened with a focus that was almost reverent. "I have walked hundreds of leagues to reach a shrine," he said. "Yet it seems holiness can be folded into common things, if men remember to look." He stayed 3 days, resting his body and refreshing his spirit. He rose early to attend lauds, though no one required him. He offered to help in small ways, gathering eggs, sweeping the cloister walk, carrying firewood. Though his hands trembled with exhaustion, he insisted that giving something back was part of healing. On his final morning, Brother Thomas fitted Etienne with a spare pair of sturdy boots from the abbey's store. The leather was plain but thick, and when the pilgrim slipped them on, he smiled with shy gratitude. Brother Conrad prepared a parcel for the road, a round of cheese wrapped in waxed cloth, a handful of dried apples, and a small slip of parchment bearing a blessing. He placed it into Etienne's pack. As the pilgrim departed, he turned to look once more at the abbey. His voice, clear in the cold air, carried back over the walls. "Thank you," he said simply, "for showing me that devotion can live in the smallest work." Long after Etienne had vanished down the winding road, the monks gathered in the scriptorium. Brother Anselm recorded the visit with the same care he gave to chronicling harvests or illness. In the margins, he added a note. "A pilgrim reminded us, the world is a place of many shrines. A wheel of cheese can be one." Chapter 12. Fire in the West Wing. The coldest month that year came earlier than the almanac predicted. By late October, the mornings were white with frost, and the orchard branches gleamed like glass in the first light. The monks had grown used to rising before dawn, shrugging into their woolen habits and carrying their breath before them in visible puffs. But no one expected that in such chill, fire could still find a way to bloom. It began on a night when the wind howled against the abbey walls and rattled the shutters in the west wing. A novice, up late copying a chapter of Liber Cassiorum, thought he smelled something acrid, but told himself it was the smoke from the kitchen hearth. When he finally opened the door to the corridor, a column of black fumes billowed toward him, carrying sparks that clung to the lintel and the hem of his robe. He shouted once, then twice, before sprinting down the stairs to ring the bell. Within moments, the community was awake, moving in practiced urgency. Buckets filled at the well, woolen blankets soaked and thrown over flames, prayers whispered as boards cracked in the heat. The fire spread quickly along the roof beams above the old storage room, leaping to the timber racks that once held parchment and grain. For an hour that felt like a night entire, the monks fought it back, inch by inch, until the flames sputtered and died, leaving the air dense with the smell of scorched oak and smoke. When dawn came, the damage was laid bare. A section of the west wing roof had collapsed inward. Two of the cellar doors were charred and hung from their hinges. Several racks of aging cheese had been lost. Soft wheels warped by heat into bulging forms that leaked their centers onto the flagstones. Brother Conrad stood among the ruin, eyes tracing the blackened ceiling. Each wheel had held a season's worth of work. He felt the ache not merely of loss, but of interruption, of a rhythm broken. Yet as the first weak sunlight slanted through the gaps in the roof, he saw something that steadied him. Along the far wall, beneath a layer of ash, the oldest wheels remained intact. They had been stored close to the foundation where the stone held back the fire. Carefully, silently, the monks lifted each one, brushing away soot. Some would need weeks to air, others, by some quiet grace, were unspoiled. The abbot gathered everyone in the cloister, where the cold wind carried away the last smell of smoke. His voice, though tired, was resolute. "We have lost part of our labor, but we have not lost our purpose. We will rebuild as we have always rebuilt." And so began a winter of repairs. A mason from the nearby village was summoned to assess the beams. The novices cleared charred timber from the cellar, working by lantern light until their arms trembled. Brother Conrad and Brother Anselm inventoried each surviving wheel, noting which might be salvaged and which must be discarded. The work was slow, often demoralizing, but it revealed something many of them had forgotten, that their strength lay not in the perfection of any single wheel, but in the patience that could outlast any calamity. Slowly, new timbers were raised, fresh racks built from oak felled on monastery land. In the evenings, the brothers gathered in the refectory, their meals simpler than before. No one complained. They shared stories of other winters, other trials. They reminded each other that every harvest is a risk, every stored thing a promise. By early spring, the west wing stood renewed. The walls smelled of fresh-cut beams and lime wash. The new racks gleamed pale under lantern light, waiting to be filled. One evening, when the last plank had been hammered into place, Brother Conrad carried in a single wheel, a modest cheese pressed from the first milk of the season. He set it on the highest shelf, a quiet declaration that the work would continue. And in the stillness that followed, each monk felt a warmth that no fire could burn away, the knowledge that they had survived together, and that survival itself was an offering. Chapter 13. The Day the King's Men Came. Spring had come in a riot of green. Grass erupted in the orchard between the gnarled trunks of the apple trees, and pale blossoms unfurled, carrying sweetness into every corner of the abbey. But alongside the return of warmth came a different kind of stirring, one that began not in nature, but in rumor. It was said that a merchant from Anjou, having tasted the monastery's rosemary wheels, had spoken so effusively at court that word reached the steward of the royal kitchens. In the weeks that followed, the monks saw travelers loitering near the gates, curious traders eager to glimpse the place that produced cheeses spoken of with near religious awe. The abbot reminded everyone not to grow vain. He knew that when something humble became admired, it could be unmade by attention. One bright morning, as Brother Conrad sorted the year's first cheeses in the cellar, a novice hurried down the steps, holding a folded parchment sealed in green wax. Conrad wiped his hands and received it, already suspecting what it would say. The letter, when opened, was brief and impeccably courteous. The steward of His Majesty's kitchens intended to visit in person, to survey the facility and confirm that the product meets the standards of His Grace. There was no invitation to decline, only the expectation of compliance. Preparations were set in motion at once. The novices scrubbed every flagstone. Brother Anselm prepared copies of Liber Caesiorum to show that the abbey's practices were transparent. Even Brother Toma arranged fresh sprigs of sage near the entrance, more to scent the air than to impress. On the appointed day, a chill breeze drifted in from the river. The steward arrived at mid-morning astride a black horse, attended by 3 liveried men and a clerk who carried an inkwell slung at his hip. His hair was as pale as linen, and his face held the kind of expression that never betrayed approval or disdain. The steward dismounted without help. He inclined his head to the abbot, but did not bow. "I am Sir Everard," he said. "His Majesty expects clarity in all matters." Brother Conrad led him first to the dairy, where milk still steamed in the great cauldron. The steward watched the stirring process with faint interest. He asked about the rennet, about the source of the cows, about the freshness of the water drawn each morning. The clerk scribbled furiously. Next, they descended into the cellars. Sir Everard examined the racks, bending close to inspect the cheeses wrapped in linen and the wheels crusted with thyme. He asked to taste 3 varieties, one young, one aged, and the rosemary wheel that had inspired so much notice. The steward chewed methodically, eyes narrowed. When he swallowed, he made no comment, merely nodded and gestured to his clerk. The scribe recorded a string of notes, dipping his pen twice. The entire room held its breath. At last, Sir Everard spoke. "His Majesty will find this acceptable. A standing order shall be arranged." The abbot clasped his hands together. "We are honored by such interest. May I ask, how often does His Majesty wish to receive our cheese?" 4 times a year, Sir Everard replied. 50 wheels per delivery, each to be marked with your seal. If consistency is lacking, the contract may be reconsidered. Silence stretched. 50 wheels per delivery meant 200 wheels a year, nearly a third of their production. The monks exchanged uneasy glances. Brother Conrad stepped forward. "Forgive my candor, sir. Our work follows the rhythms of season and herd. We cannot force the yield without compromising what makes the cheese worthy of your attention." Sir Everard regarded him with a thin smile. "Then you must decide if you prefer renown or simplicity." He turned to go, but the abbot lifted a hand. "We will confer and reply within a fortnight." After the steward departed, the brothers gathered in the chapter house. The air felt colder than before, though the sun still slanted warm across the flagstones. The novices sat in a tense semicircle, awaiting guidance. Brother Anselm spoke first, his voice low. "Such a contract would pay for repairs, arms, new parchment, more than we have dared hope." Brother Toma frowned. "But we did not take our vows to become purveyors to kings. I fear that in striving to please a distant table, we will neglect the hands that shaped this craft." A heated debate followed. Each monk weighed duty against need, honor against risk. It was Brother Conrad who listened longest without speaking. When all others had finished, he rose.